It was a quiet night when Jace stood in front of his friend, Larnak, the alien warrior. The two had been through many battles together, fighting side by side, forging a bond that went deeper than friendship. Larnak, with his tall, broad frame and blue skin, had always been someone Jace could trust. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Larnak's face was serious, the usual grin replaced by a look of concern. "I need you to promise me something, Jace," Larnak said, his voice deep, almost a whisper. "My daughters, after everything that's happened, I need to know they will be safe. You are the only one I trust. Will you protect them?" Jace felt a pang in his chest as Larnak's words hit him. He had known Larnak for years, and though they came from different worlds, the bond they shared was as strong as any family connection. The idea of Larnak's daughters, young and innocent, being left vulnerable in a harsh, unforgiving world made Jace's blood boil. He couldn't imagine them living in danger. "I swear, Larnak," Jace replied without hesitation, his eyes locking with his friend's. "I'll protect them with my life. They'll be safe as long as I draw a breath." Larnak nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude, but also something deeper, fear. Fear that something might happen to his daughters, something beyond his control. The promise that Jace made wasn't just an empty vow. It was an oath that would bind them both. For Jace, this wasn't just about protecting innocent lives. It was about the brotherhood they had built over years of fighting together. The bond of trust that now stretched to Larnak's daughters. He knew the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he was determined to follow through. As Jace left Larnak's side that night, his mind raced. He had no idea what fate would throw at him. The universe was unpredictable, and danger was always lurking around every corner. But one thing was for certain. He would not break his promise. His commitment to Larnak and his daughters would be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Little did Jace know, that promise would soon take him down a path he never expected, one that would change his life forever. The future held secrets and challenges he wasn't ready for, but the oath he made would set him on a course that could alter everything. And love, something he never anticipated, was about to find its way into the heart of his mission. Jace's journey began the very next morning. He made his way to the quiet, isolated compound where Larnak's daughters had been living ever since the war had started. It was a small, hidden enclave on a distant planet, far from the chaos that raged across the universe. The compound had once been a peaceful place, but now it was guarded, its tranquility shattered by the ever-present threat of enemies. The alien daughters, Aria and Lyra, were in their early 20s, strong-willed, intelligent, and surprisingly independent for their age. Despite being the daughters of a powerful alien leader, they had always been taught to fend for themselves, never relying too much on others. They weren't fragile princesses, but warriors in their own right. Jace had met them before and knew that both had their own ways of dealing with the circumstances they were thrown into. But now, it was his duty to ensure they would be safe. When Jace arrived at the compound, he was greeted by Aria, the older of the two sisters. She stood tall, with fiery red hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. She had heard of Jace's promise, but there was skepticism in her voice as she greeted him. "You're here to protect us, then?" Aria asked, her tone neither warm nor cold, but direct. "What makes you think you can do what our father hasn't?" Jace hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. The truth was, he wasn't sure he could keep them safe. No one could truly protect someone from the galaxy's dangers. But his promise to Larnak echoed in his mind, and he stood tall, meeting Aria's piercing gaze. "I'm here to do my best. That's all I can offer," he said, his voice steady. "Your father trusted me, and I won't break that trust." Aria studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly, accepting his words. She stepped aside to let him into the compound, where Lyra, the younger sister, was waiting. Lyra was quieter, more reserved, with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed to reflect a deep sadness. She was the more delicate of the two, but Jace knew she carried a strength that was hidden behind her gentler demeanor. The two sisters led him to a small living area where they discussed their plans for the day. It wasn't long before Jace noticed something unsettling. As the conversation progressed, there was a tension in the air. The sisters exchanged worried glances, and Jace could feel the weight of their fears pressing down on them. It wasn't just the external threats they were afraid of. There was something deeper, something darker that they hadn't shared with him yet. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Jace walked the perimeter of the compound, keeping watch. But as he rounded a corner, something caught his eye. A shadow darting quickly between the trees. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately ran toward the movement. It wasn't a soldier or guard. It was someone, or something, much more dangerous. He quickly realized that the compound was already being watched. His heart raced as he ran back to the main building, where Arya and Lyra were, and warned them of the situation. But when he entered the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Arya's hand was shaking as she reached for a hidden communication device, and Lyra was staring out the window with an expression that was far from surprised. "They know we're here," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "We need to move, Jace. It's only a matter of time before they come for us." Jace's mind raced. The promise he made to Larnak wasn't just a simple task. It was a life-or-death mission, and it had only just begun. He didn't know who was after them or why, but he knew one thing. He had to keep these two safe, no matter the cost. The real test was just beginning, and as the night crept in, Jace realized that protecting them would require more than just physical strength. It would demand every ounce of his willpower and cunning. There were forces at play far greater than he ever imagined, and they were closing in fast. The following morning, Jace woke up early, the weight of his promise still hanging heavy on his chest. The threat was real, and it was only a matter of time before the compound was attacked. He had to prepare the sisters, though it seemed they were already ready for what lay ahead. Arya and Lyra were skilled in combat, having grown up surrounded by danger, but their strength alone would not be enough to survive what was coming. They needed strategy, and they needed trust in Jace. The air was thick with tension as Jace gathered the sisters for a plan. They huddled around a small table, where he had spread out a map of the compound's surroundings. The perimeter was vast and dotted with hidden trails that could be used to escape, or, more likely, to ambush. "We can't just sit here waiting," Jace said, his voice grim but steady. "They know we're here, and they'll be coming for us soon. We need to be ready." Arya, ever the strategist, nodded in agreement. "I've been studying the enemy's movements for months. I know their tactics. But we'll need to act quickly. We can't wait for them to make the first move." The room fell silent for a moment, as they all took in the gravity of the situation. Jace could see the determination in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a hint of fear, not for themselves, but for the others. Arya and Lyra cared deeply for their people. Their love for their home was obvious, but they were also carrying the weight of their father's legacy. Protecting the compound was not just about survival. It was about proving their worth. Jace knew what he had to do. He had to be more than just their protector. He had to be the leader they needed. He had to show them that together, they could survive anything. "All right," Jace said, snapping the group out of their thoughts. "Here's the plan. We're going to fortify the main building and create escape routes. Lyra, I want you to check the communications array and make sure everything is still secure. Arya, you and I will go out and set up some defensive positions along the trails. If they come for us, we'll be ready." Lyra nodded quickly and left the room, her face focused and serious. Arya lingered, watching Jace closely. He could feel the weight of her gaze, and he knew she was questioning his plan, just as she always did. But this time, there was something different in her expression. Trust. "I'm not used to relying on others," Arya said, her voice low. "But I trust you, Jace. Just don't let me down." Jace met her eyes. There was no arrogance, no bravado in his gaze, just raw honesty. "I won't let you down. We'll get through this together." The tension lifted slightly, but there was still no time to waste. They quickly moved into action, setting up traps and barriers, preparing for the worst. The compound that had once been a peaceful haven now felt like a fortress under siege. Every noise, every rustle in the wind made their hearts race, but they pushed through. Hours passed in tense silence, each person moving swiftly to their assigned tasks. Jace kept his eyes on the perimeter, but his thoughts kept returning to Aria and Lyra. They were not just sisters. They were survivors, and they would do whatever it took to protect what they loved. As dusk fell, the quiet was shattered by the unmistakable sound of distant engines. The enemy was near. Jace grabbed his weapon and motioned for Aria to follow him. The first wave was approaching, and they had no more time to prepare. They had to fight now, or risk losing everything. They met the enemy on the edge of the compound, their weapons gleaming under the fading light. The enemy was fierce, well-trained, and merciless. But Jace had a plan. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain, and they used that to their benefit. The battle was quick but brutal. Jace fought side by side with Aria, their movements in perfect sync, a testament to the bond they had begun to form. Despite the odds, they held their ground. But as the last of the enemy soldiers fell, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was more coming, and they needed to be ready. The battle was over, but the real war had just begun. Jace realized that the promise he made to Larnak, protecting his daughters, would be tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. There was no turning back now. The enemy was relentless, and Jace knew that the hardest fights lay ahead. But he was ready. The future of the compound, and of Aria and Lyra, depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. As the dust settled, and the stars began to shine brightly in the sky, Jace stood watch, ready for whatever came next. The fight for survival was far from over. After the battle, there was a strange calm that settled over the compound. The night was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The enemy had retreated, but they would surely return. That much was certain. Jace knew they couldn't let their guard down for a second. As he walked through the compound, checking the fortifications, his thoughts turned to Aria and Lyra. Despite the victory, their faces had been clouded with concern. This wasn't over. They knew the enemy was still out there, waiting for their next chance to strike. Jace stopped by the small campfire where Aria was sitting, sharpening her blade. The firelight flickered across her features, casting shadows that made her look more intense, more determined than ever. "You did well today," Jace said, his voice soft but sincere. Aria didn't look up. She kept working on her weapon. Focused. "We're not done yet. We've only pushed them back for a short time. I'll be ready for when they come again." Jace nodded, sitting down beside her. "I know, but you did your part, and so did Lyra. We'll make it through this, Aria. We just have to keep pushing forward." Aria stopped sharpening her blade and turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You keep saying that, Jace, but you're not the one who's lost everything. You don't know what it feels like to have everything you care about taken away." Jace's heart sank at her words. He didn't know. He could never know. He had never faced the kind of loss that Aria and Lyra had suffered, but that didn't mean he couldn't understand. "I may not know what it feels like to lose everything," he said slowly, his voice firm, "but I do know what it means to protect what's important to you. And right now, what's important to me is keeping you and your sister safe. We're a team, Aria, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Aria's gaze softened. She looked away, her eyes scanning the distant stars. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. It was as though an unspoken understanding had passed between them. They were in this together, no matter the odds. "Thank you," Aria finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I can be hard on you, but I appreciate everything you've done for us." Jace gave a small, reassuring smile. "No need to thank me. We're in this together." But as the night grew darker, a sense of unease crept back into Jace's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the battle they had fought earlier was just a warning. The real danger was still out there, and it was coming for them all. Meanwhile, Lyra, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, stood up from where she had been quietly observing nearby. She walked over to the fire, her eyes bright with determination. She had seen something in Jace, a strength that had drawn her in from the very beginning. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave him said it all. There was more to this situation than just survival. There was something deeper, something that had begun to form between them all. Lyra wasn't naive. She knew the cost of the war they were fighting. But she also knew something else. The bond between her sister, and Jace was growing stronger. This wasn't just a matter of protection anymore. It was a matter of trust, and perhaps something more. "You've proven yourself, Jace," Lyra said, her voice steady but warm. "We'll fight beside you, and we'll win. Together." Jace looked at both of the sisters, feeling a surge of emotion. They had become more than just people he was sworn to protect. They had become a part of him, and as dangerous as this mission was, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The battle had brought them together, but it was the moments like this, when words were unnecessary and only the bond between them mattered, that had begun to define what they were fighting for. Just as Jace opened his mouth to respond, a sound from the distance interrupted their quiet moment. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Footsteps. And they were getting closer. The enemy had returned. The tension in the air thickened once again. Jace stood, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. He met Arya's and Lyra's eyes. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. "Ready yourself," Jace said quietly, but with determination. "We've trained for this. We will fight. And we will win." The sisters nodded, the firelight reflecting in their eyes. They weren't just protecting their home anymore. They were protecting each other. As they moved into position, the sound of the enemy's footsteps grew louder. Jace had no doubt they would make it through this, together. But the real test was about to begin. The distant sound of footsteps grew louder, more pronounced, as if the entire enemy force was marching toward them with a relentless, unstoppable momentum. Jace tightened his grip on his weapon, his muscles tensing in anticipation. Arya and Lyra were already at the ready, their faces set in grim determination, each holding their weapons with confidence. The compound had been fortified to the best of their abilities, but Jace knew that it wouldn't be enough to withstand a full assault. The walls were sturdy, but the enemy had numbers and firepower, and they were coming fast. "We need to hold them off long enough for reinforcements to arrive," Jace murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. His mind raced, weighing their options. They didn't have the luxury of time or resources. It was now or never. Arya stepped up beside him, her gaze sharp as she scanned the horizon. "We'll hold the line," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "We've fought harder battles than this. We'll make sure they don't get through." Lyra, who had been crouching low behind a barrier, stood up and added, "We know what they're capable of, but we're not backing down. Not this time." Jace nodded, grateful for their strength, but his mind kept circling back to something that had been nagging him ever since the battle earlier. This wasn't just about protecting the compound or surviving the fight. Something else was at stake, something more personal. The feeling in the air, the strange connection between them, had been growing ever since they had first met. The bond he shared with the sisters was undeniable. He didn't know when it had begun, but he could feel it deep within him now. And as much as he tried to focus on the task at hand, he couldn't shake the realization that this battle would be different. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something much deeper. "Everyone take your positions," Jace barked, breaking the silence. His voice was authoritative, but beneath it lay the tension he was trying to suppress. The reality of the situation was setting in, and he could feel the weight of what was to come. They had no choice but to give it everything they had. As the enemy approached, Jace's mind flashed back to the promise he had made to the sisters. He had sworn to protect them, no matter the cost. But now, as the first wave of enemies reached the compound gates, he realized just how much that promise meant. He was willing to lay down his life for them if it meant ensuring their safety. A sharp crack filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The enemy had begun their assault. Jace and the sisters sprang into action. Arya dashed toward the front line, her blade gleaming under the moonlight, while Lyra moved quickly, taking up a position to flank their attackers. Jace followed closely behind, his weapon raised and ready. The first wave of enemy soldiers hit the compound with brutal force, their weapons lighting up the night with deadly precision. But the trio was ready. Arya fought with a ferocity that matched the chaos around them, cutting down enemies with quick, clean strikes. Lyra, equally skilled, used her agility to stay one step ahead, taking down their foes from unexpected angles. Jace, meanwhile, stood his ground, using his training and experience to pick off enemies from a distance. Every shot he fired felt calculated, every move deliberate. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, but even more than that, he felt the need to protect, to keep them safe. This wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about something he had come to cherish deeply. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the enemy was relentless. They were more than just soldiers. They were driven by a hatred that seemed to fuel their every move. And with each passing second, Jace could see the toll the fight was taking on his team. Arya was already covered in sweat, her movements growing more erratic as she fought off wave after wave of attackers. Lyra, though quick and sharp, was starting to show signs of exhaustion. Jace knew they couldn't keep this up for much longer. "We need to fall back," Jace shouted, his voice rising above the noise of the battlefield. "We can't win this fight if we're spread out." Reluctantly, Arya and Lyra complied, making their way back toward the central compound. The enemy was closing in, and the battle was far from over. They needed a strategy, something that would turn the tide in their favor. As Jace rejoined the sisters, he saw the determination in their eyes. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other, and that, he realized, made them stronger than anything the enemy could throw at them. "This isn't over," Jace said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We're not giving up, not while we're still standing." Arya gave him a quick, reassuring nod, her expression hardened with resolve. "We'll fight to the end, Jace, together." And with that, the three of them prepared for the next wave. The enemy may have been closing in, but they weren't going to make it easy. Not while the bond between them was this strong. The battle for the compound had only just begun. The tension between the human soldier and the alien princess had reached its peak. What had begun as a promise of protection had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Their bond had deepened over time, and the feelings they now shared were undeniable. Yet, the weight of their situation still hung heavily over them both. In the cold, desolate terrain of the alien planet, they stood together, both lost in their own thoughts. The soldier had sworn to protect the alien princess's daughters, a promise he had made to his long-lost friend. However, as the days passed, his protective instincts had shifted from her daughters to the princess herself. What started as loyalty to a friend had slowly turned into something more complex: love. The princess, though powerful and regal, was not immune to the emotions she had been trying so hard to suppress. The soldier's presence had always made her feel safe, but lately that safety had become something deeper, something that tugged at her heartstrings in a way she had never known before. She couldn't deny it any longer. As the two stood beneath the starry sky, the princess took a step closer to him. The silent air between them crackled with unspoken words, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The soldier looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had fallen for her, but the weight of his promise, The responsibility he had taken on had made him doubt his own feelings. "I never meant for it to happen like this," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The princess gazed at him with soft eyes, a mixture of sadness and longing. "You promised to protect us," she murmured. "But I know now. I know what I truly want." The air grew thick with the promise of something more, something neither of them had planned for. The soldier's breath hitched as the princess reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was a gesture so small, yet so powerful, that it made his heart race. "We're from two different worlds," the soldier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swore to protect your daughters. But now, I can't ignore what I feel for you." Her gaze softened, and she placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You have always protected us. And now, I want you to protect me in a way you never thought possible." The soldier's heart skipped a beat as he finally understood. The universe had not brought them together by chance. It had brought them together because they were meant to be. Love had found its way, and there was no turning back. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The moment was electric, charged with the weight of their unspoken feelings. As their lips met, the world around them seemed to fade away. The only thing that mattered was the connection they had forged. No longer bound by promises of protection, they were free to love each other as they truly wished. They had defied the odds, and in doing so, they had found something greater than either of them could have imagined. Their love story had only just begun. The days following their confession were filled with a quiet intensity. They could no longer deny the powerful connection between them, but the challenges ahead were far from over. Their love was still fragile, a delicate balance between the promise the soldier had made to protect the princess's daughters and the undeniable bond he had formed with the princess herself. Their love had defied all expectations, but now it had to stand the test of the harsh realities that surrounded them. The princess's people still looked to her for guidance and leadership, while the soldier struggled with his own sense of duty and his newfound love. Their worlds were so different, yet they had come to depend on each other in a way that was hard to explain. The future seemed uncertain, but there was one thing they both knew for sure: they couldn't go back. In the quiet of the alien princess's chambers, they sat together in silence. The soldier held her hand, their fingers intertwined, feeling the warmth of their connection. They had both been through so much, but now they were facing the hardest test of all: the unknown. The princess spoke first, her voice soft, but filled with determination. "I never thought I would find someone who understood me, someone who could see beyond my title and my position. You've shown me that love doesn't follow rules or boundaries. It just exists." The soldier looked at her, his heart swelling with affection. "I never expected to fall for you, but the moment I swore to protect your daughters, I knew my life was going to change. What I didn't know was that I would end up protecting you too, in ways I never imagined." She smiled, a tear glistening in the corner of her eye. "And now that you've protected me, you've given me a chance to live a life I never thought possible. A life with you." The soldier's chest tightened with emotion as he leaned in, brushing his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, full of promises that were still unspoken, but it spoke volumes of the love they now shared. They had crossed the boundaries of friendship, duty, and responsibility. They had come to understand one another in ways neither had anticipated. But even as they reveled in their newfound love, they both knew the future would not be easy. There were still many obstacles to overcome: political tensions, cultural differences, and the looming threat of enemies who would seek to tear them apart. Yet, despite the challenges ahead, they were ready to face them together. The soldier and the princess stood, their hands still clasped tightly, looking out over the vast alien landscape that stretched before them. It was a new beginning for both of them, one filled with uncertainty, but also with endless possibilities. "We'll face whatever comes next, together," the soldier vowed, his voice steady and filled with conviction. The princess nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Together," she echoed, "no matter the cost." And as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held, they knew that love had already changed their lives forever. No matter what came next, they would face it with the strength of their bond, unbroken, unyielding, and unstoppable.